Good morning, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I talk with journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, is still terrorizing neighborhoods and imprisoning people. Now that even though we are months away from the horrors that we saw in Minneapolis, we continue to see this in New Jersey and across the country. With all of these horrors, there is sometimes an audience with far-right extremists linking up with ICE and some of their allies, including Greg Bovino, who is apparently now considering a run for president. We are going to talk with Chris Matthias, who is a longtime journalist. He has been covering ICE and right-wing extremism for years. He got a firsthand look into some of these tactics for ICE, and looking forward to talking with Chris about all of this and more today. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be back. Thank you.
Well, Chris, last time we talked about your book, To Catch a Fascist, where you had just a fascinating look at the Antifa movement and on the tactics that people have been deploying for years to fight back against fascists, both of those in and outside of our government. And I know that was probably great preparation for you for some of your recent reporting that you've been doing on ICE and their tactics. Can you talk with us about some of that reporting?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, it's interesting. I think maybe we touched on this a little bit, but the book is about fascists wearing masks and the anti-fascist activists devoted to ripping those masks off. But now that we're kind of in this mask off fascist moment, a lot of people don't feel the need to hide their faces when they talk about very extreme things. And it's interesting now that, the people that you see wearing masks most often are ICE agents.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an understanding that they know what they are doing is not popular, and that they might face repercussions socially for being a part of this. There's a real parallel between what we saw in 2017, 2018, 2019, when the far right and fascists and Nazis were taking to the streets. Charlottesville, Gainesville, Berkeley, Lansing, all these big kind of far right demonstrations, where the anti-fascist response was to follow them, monitor them, survey them, identify them, pressure businesses and hotels not to do business with them. And I think when you look at the uprisings now against ICE, they bear a striking similarity. They're doing the same tactics that were once used against Nazis taking to the streets. Now it's armed agents of the state. And I think that goes to show the degree to which so much of kind of fascist language and ideas have gone mainstream. It's not these kind of fringy alt-right activists in the streets. It is fascism in power, and be an agency that is enacting a program. Its task is ethnic cleansing, and we can get into the Bovino stuff in a bit, but knowing that he was the head of the operations in Minneapolis, Chicago, LA, and knowing since he's retired who he's been hanging out with, I think lays bare kind of the ethno-nationalism at the heart of ICE.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when Trump cast Greg Bovino aside back in March, we were all hoping that we had seen the last of him.
Yeah.
But, clearly we haven't. The idea that he's going on these, extreme right podcasts, he's saying that he's setting up an exploratory committee to run for president. He is wildly unpopular, yet he does have a foothold, with the far right. How seriously should we be taking Greg Bovino at this point?
Yeah, I think the lesson that I have taken over the last 10 years is that these kind of fringe farcical figures you actually have to take pretty seriously. Because if you look at who's in power now, and the people in the administration or surrounding the administration, figures like Jack Posobiec and Laura Loomer, and, kind of this government by influencers, I think you have to take these characters kind of seriously, however ridiculous they might seem, and however farcical in this case, Bovino's purported presidential campaign is. He claims that there's an exploratory committee, there's this website. You look at the website, it's run by 3 kind of weird MAGA operatives with checkered pasts, one of whom runs like a Bovino superfan account on Twitter. And another one, Jacob Engels, who was, kind of a Roger Stone protege, who was mixed up in Stop the Steal, did a lot of stunts with Laura Loomer, and most recently was arrested at a motel in Wisconsin for methamphetamine use and possession and resisting arrest. So when you kind of look at the Bovino 2028 campaign and how, whether or not it's really serious, is up for debate. What is not up for debate is the fact that Bovino has clearly gotten a taste for the spotlight. He has fans, and was welcomed like a celebrity at a straight up fascist conference in Europe, which is something I wrote about. Bovino went to what's called the Remigration 2026 summit. It was in Portugal, and it was basically a collection of the farthest right figures in Europe, folks like Martin Sellner. And if your listeners aren't familiar with Martin Sellner was the head of the Austrian chapter of a group called Generation Identity, which is a straight up white nationalist group. He was among those that would do the stunts in the Mediterranean, kind of targeting refugee boats and trying to get them to turn back. He exchanged emails with the man who shot up 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And that shooter actually donated money to Martin Sellner. I could go on, but basically just think a very, very extreme figure who has worked very hard to make remigration a word in Europe and in America, and it's just a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. And you have Bovino, 2 months out from literally running these immigration sweeps and the crackdowns on protesters in Minneapolis, Chicago. And he's taking a selfie with Martin Sellner in Portugal. He's doing interviews. He is hailed as a hero at this remigration summit by straight up fascists. And, I think we are inundated with so many concurrent crises right now and so many outrages and scandals that nothing really gets that much traction in the news cycle. But, it should be a giant scandal that this guy is, a straight up, looks like at least that he's a straight up fascist, a straight up white nationalist. And, he's been Bovino has also become kind of a prolific shit poster on X. And after my story, he's been like responding. And like I, tweeted, another story I did about Bovino is that he ended up going on this white supremacist podcast run by Kevin Deanna, who was a really formative writer in the like beginning of the alt-right, like 10, 15 years ago. He literally wrote a kind of viral essay on the right called a white nationalist memo to white male Republicans. It's about as explicitly racist as you could imagine. And this is the waters that Bovino is swimming in. Like, he goes on Kevin Deanna's podcast now and has a friendly conversation with him about remigration. Bovino doesn't respond to my request for comment, but when the story goes up, he starts replying to me on Twitter. I text back or tweet back a screenshot of all the horrible things that Kevin Deanna has said and, ask him about his feelings about it. And he basically just says, LOL. Like, he is, it's a really remarkable situation. Again, he's also like a farcical figure. He's on this European trip right now, and is in Romania and posted a photo of himself from what he claims is Vlad the Impaler's tomb. Vlad the Impaler, I think, being the inspiration for Dracula. But Bovino is holding up Vlad Impaler. And by the way, there's like a lot of disagreement that this is like actually where Vlad the Impaler is actually buried. But Bovino makes this bizarre post about how Vlad the Impaler was like a historical example of like people standing up against the invasion of immigrants. And then of course you look at his like summary of who Vlad the Impaler is, and it's like an AI grok summary, which is like inaccurate. So it's, simultaneously farcical and dangerous.
Right. But we've seen this over and over again with the Trump administration. I mean, they just most recently posted a false quote of Teddy Roosevelt when they announced that Trump was going to be speaking at his library. I mean, they seem to really delight in swimming in inaccuracies and trying to get people to believe them as part of this far-right agenda. And, as I was reading your piece on Kevin Deanna and, the fact that this is somebody who, he believes in the deportation of 100 million people. He says there's a war on our soil. And then I think back to Trump's first run for president. And I know, you covered that, and, I did as well. And we would have these quaint debates over, is Trump really racist? And this persisted throughout his first presidency and his subsequent, runs for president. We would have these real debates, and a lot of very serious people would say, well, you don't know what's in his heart, and, who knows? But I mean, when you hire a guy like Bovino, and when his entire agenda is to ethnically cleanse people, I mean, I feel like we really wasted a lot of time on this. And I'm wondering why you think there was such a debate when there was such a preponderance of evidence that this was exactly what Trump was talking about and what his agenda was.
Yeah. I think there's like this kind of reflexive tendency in American media to appear objective and unbiased, that you end up working really hard to manufacture, defenses and justifications for what is explicit racism and bigotry and, ultimately, fascism. And we've seen this over and over again. And I think there's also, this kind of, I would argue maybe like liberal centrist kind of faith, this abiding faith in the like kind of myth of progressiveness, that like we are as a society always getting better and advancing, and that the horrors of the past could never visit the present, which I think makes people kind of disbelieve that something could be as bad as it actually is. And I truly think that I'm glad you brought up those kind of like tedious debates that feel so quaint now, and especially around the F word. Like there's so much debates about, is he a fascist? Is MAGA a fascist? And I think that debate's pretty resolved. You had why am I blanking on his name right now? Robert Paxton, The Anatomy of Fascism, one of the foremost scholars of fascism, declined to call Trump a fascist in the first term. Then, after January 6th, revises his opinion and says, yes, Trump is a fascist. And I think, we see that dynamic kind of at work all over the place right now.
You were talking about how right-wing influencers, have been have such cachet with the Trump administration, and some of them have been hired. And it made me think of Bovino's tenure when he was basically running ICE. I mean, he kind of ran it like an influencer. It was basically all for the gram. He had the Nazi-like trench coat. Of course, he said it wasn't, but I mean, anybody who studied the fashion, it was definitely reminiscent. He would go around Minneapolis and Chicago with just an entourage of security, even, famously to go take a leak at Target when he was in Minneapolis. Right. And so there's this great performance element to it. But at the same time, his policies were incredibly brutal, and he cataloged as, actually like throwing, like a Molotov cocktail into a crowd, in Chicago. He wasn't just on camera. He was an active participant. And so how do we process all of this? Because, even if you have been a longtime critic of ICE and their tactics, this is a whole other level to have someone who is willing to engage in this kind of fascist behavior and to have the kind of power that he did.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely represented like a real escalation of things, and like, this like making what was barely subtext when it came with ICE, like, text, like making it so explicit. And I think he recognized, like when we think about MAGA in general, it is what Bovino was doing was kind of very part and parcel with that, kind of very performative for the gram, for social media, this kind of like very transgressive behavior, putting himself front and center. And I think it's also interesting when you step back and think about the reason for the surge in Minneapolis was largely because of the work of another influencer, like, the Nick Shirley stuff, like when he manufactured the story about like the Somali daycare fraud,
Right.
And like that was kind of the pretext for this surge in ICE deployment and the crackdown, or the sweeps. And, ultimately, like, we talked a little bit about kind of the grassroots, like, anti-fascist response, like, kind of running ICE out of town to a certain degree. And, afterwards, when Alex Preddy and Renee Good are murdered, Bovino says that Preddy, was trying to massacre law enforcement, which, of course, was a, bald-faced lie. We all watched the video. Right. And like the public backlash was just intense enough, I think, that even the Trump administration as shameless as it is, realized that it was on the back foot and had to do something, and pushes Bovino out. And I think like Trump kind of hilariously describes Bovino as like out there, like a little out there, which
Right.
like if Trump is saying that about you. So it's interesting that as much as like Bovino might appear fringe and farcical now, or even when he was, still in Border Patrol, still the commander at large in these operations, now that he's calling for 100 million people deported, like he's the kind of character, I think, in the MAGA universe that like opens the Overton window more and more again, like he is so outrageous, so outlandish that, but eventually, I wouldn't be surprised if the wider MAGA movement, if Trump kind of adopts this language of 100 million, and so on and so forth. So I think he's an important character to keep an eye on.
There are so many people on the far right, influencers at this point. It's kind of hard to keep track of all of them. I think we have a clip of Bovino on with Kevin Deanna that we can play.
Sure.
Culture and our homeland, the worse here, and it's immigration related. So whatever I can do to ensure those mass deportations take effect here, that's what I want to do. The mass deportation of illegal aliens, that's the number one issue that faces our country, that's faced our country for several years now. And if that meant running for president, I would do that.
Yeah.
So how are you able to keep track of all of the people who are out there who are shaping our media landscape like this right now?
Well, once I figure out an answer to that question, I'll let you know. But no, I think it's a lot of work, and I think once you start to kind of swim in these MAGA circles, you see where stuff gets traction and who is getting a lot of attention. In Bovino's case, it's easy because he just posted it. So he just posted his interview with Deanna, but very quickly with Deanna, I think I already mentioned this, but like he years ago, 10, 15 years ago, he wrote behind pseudonyms to express his white nationalism. He had names like Gregory Hood and I'm blanking on the others, but he wrote for places like Countercurrents and V-Dare and American Renaissance, which are like explicitly white nationalist publications. Eventually, there is a woman he's dating at the time who's an editor at Breitbart named Katie McHugh.
Right.
And basically she, realizes the water she's swimming in. She leaves the right, and she ends up giving all of these emails to reporters, and it's the foundation for a bunch of remarkable reporting that comes out at the time, showing just how extreme the MAGA coalition is. And one of those stories by my friend Hannah Gase at the Southern Poverty Law Center, pieces together the fact that Kevin Deanna, who is like kind of a whatever conservative figure at the time, is also using these pseudonyms to write the most extreme stuff, including this very viral essay called A White Nationalist Manifesto for white male Republicans, which if you go back and read it, is in response to Obama's second victory, and it's like a remarkably racist document. And it's a really formative text for the beginning of the alt-right. So to fast forward to the moment now where Kevin Deanna not only is using his real name, on a podcast that is sponsored by American Renaissance, which is a straight up white supremacist organization, to host Greg Bovino, who 2 months ago was, head of Border Patrol, who was in front of every news camera in the country and was like, the center of attention around the world, is, I think, a remarkable depiction of where things have gone in this country and what the emergency is right now.
And in recent months, we've seen group chats that have been leaked by like young Republican leaders, and it's just full of explicitly Nazi rhetoric. Just extreme violence and anti-Semitism and misogyny out there, and now it's like all out in the open. Nobody's writing under a pseudonym anymore. I know there's an ongoing debate where some people think, well, at least it's out there and we know what we're dealing with. But the fact that people aren't worried about losing their jobs anymore, they actually think this might be a way to fast track their careers within the Republican Party. That to me seems very dangerous.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think we're in a very dangerous moment. And I think this is kind of the, thesis of my book. And I think the task right now is, I think you see there's a phrase that's been getting traction on social media lately. It's essentially bring back shame. And there has to be this effort to kind of, remanufacture social taboos, and norms, you can't in a pluralistic democratic society say can I curse? Yeah. Say the shit that people are saying, and get a job in the government. So I don't know exactly what that looks like right now. I think it's a lot of coalition building and grassroots work. But we are at this moment where it's not only Bovino, we talked about the term remigration being a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. The DHS social media accounts, the White House social media accounts, Trump himself, Stephen Miller, they all use these terms.
Right.
There's been a lot of reporting showing the way that the White House DHS is sourcing their propaganda directly from fascist accounts. They are borrowing heavily from old fascist aesthetics, and straight up neo-Nazi imagery and slogans. And I don't know what, they're telling us, they are not hiding it right now. And to whatever degree that people still can't see this, it's time to see it.
You were mentioning some reporting from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and of course, the Trump administration is going after that organization, which has been around to hold extremists accountable for decades, and has done just so much work in unearthing extremists and networks and what they've been doing. It seems to me, in addition to the fact that the case, like so many of these political prosecutions, seems rather flimsy, but it's very telling, isn't it, that they're going after people who are trying to unearth fascists. I mean, that's quite the tell about what side of this fight the Trump administration is on.
Yeah, I think what's happening to the SPLC is alarming, and the SPLC has been a thorn in the far right side for a long time, and this is definitely revenge, and an attempt to destroy them. And the SPLC is kind of the more formal, nonprofit, mainstreamy version of what a lot of anti-fascist work is, which is just intelligence gathering, monitoring, sometimes infiltrating. And I haven't personally looked at the kind of criminal charges complained against the SPLC yet. I think the accusation is that essentially Nazi groups wouldn't be real if the SPLC weren't propping them up with informants and money and stuff, which of course is just a ridiculous narrative. But yeah,
Also,
and you know,
apparently inside Charlottesville, which I know you were there covering. So that was
yeah,
their
which is
support, apparently.
yeah, which is so. I mean, this is so infuriating and insulting, and another attempt to, you know, kind of delegitimize, or kind of, it's an attempt at a revisionist history of what was a shocking white supremacist rally. And yeah, and I think if you were there and witnessed what I witnessed and what other people witnessed, you'd be doubly infuriated by that idea. But you know, what's happening to the SPLC is part of a larger project to squash dissent and to squash opposition to MAGA. We are starting to see prosecutions of, you know, alleged Antifa cells and activists. We are starting to see the prosecutions and arrests of people that, you know, have pushed back against ICE. And there is a real kind of burgeoning effort to attack parts of the left or the liberal establishment that have been a thorn in MAGA's side for a long time. And, you know, as a reporter, I've relied a lot on SPLC's work and the intelligence they've gathered on the far right. It's been an invaluable resource. And, you know, if we lose that work and lose an organization like that, you know, and by the way, this isn't to do a hagiography of the SPLC. The SPLC has a lot of problems, and like a lot of people, you know, that I've worked with over the years or talked to there, you know, are open about that. But it should be still alarming for critics of the SPLC to see what the Trump administration is trying to do to that organization.
I wanted to talk with you about some of your other recent reporting that you did for MS Now. You kind of unearthed another white nationalist influencer who hosts the Law and Border podcast, but has been given just exclusive access to what ICE has been doing, filming propaganda in service to its mission, and it definitely is part of an explicit agenda for the Trump administration to have these influencers in tow to get out the message. But can you talk with us about who he is, what he's been doing, and you know, why we should be so concerned?
Yeah, so there's been this kind of this weird phenomenon, which maybe is not all that weird actually, but basically ever since Trump came back into power, and ICE has, you know, intensified its immigration raids, they have often partnered with MAGA influencers to create propaganda. And there's been a lot of examples of this, but you know, the people that they're giving repeated access to, exclusive access to, are these kind of MAGA loyalists who they can count on to push whatever narrative that ICE wants and that, like, the Trump administration wants. And that's how I kind of came across Ben Burkwam, who is part of the Real America's Voice network with, I think most people would know through like Steve Bannon and like the War Room podcast. And, you know, he kind of was like this MAGA stunt artist that came up doing these like stunts for social media. He like stormed the governor's mansion in California with Laura Loomer to like some anti-immigrant stunt. He dressed up as like a racist caricature of a Mexican that he called Pancho Benny, I think. He was part of like anti-lockdown measures and like anti-vax movement stuff. He stormed the house of the city council president in Fresno, California over lockdown measures. He was with Marjorie Taylor Greene before she got elected to Congress, when they like kind of stormed AOC and Ilhan Omar's office on the Hill. And, you know, over this time, he becomes this big MAGA influencer. Steve Bannon takes a liking to him. And he's producing a lot of propaganda at the border with like sympathetic like sheriffs and border agents who are all pushing this narrative of an invasion at the border and like being abandoned by the Biden administration. And then, you know, when Trump gets back into power, he suddenly is doing a lot of ride-alongs with ICE, you know, where he is in the vehicle with ICE agents in the ICE vehicle, recording, getting a front row seat to immigration raids, to immigrants being detained. And, you know, he blurs out the agents' faces, but keeps the immigrants' faces very much in focus. And those faces are often distraught and, you know, sad. They're being ripped away from their families. And, you know, the narrative that Burkwam is pushing in all of these videos that he makes is that ICE is going after criminals and that immigrants are just kind of like as a monolith criminals. And, you know, the interesting thing about Burkwam is that when you look at who he associates with and who's he's making this propaganda with, they're all criminals themselves. Like they all have history of like violent arrests. Burkwam himself he'd been arrested for allegedly assaulting a Telemundo cameraman at the border. That charge was eventually, he was convicted and it was overturned on appeal. One of the consistent narratives that Burkwam likes to push with his propaganda is that illegal immigrants are dangerous drivers, that they import third world driving habits to the US, and that it puts lives in danger. Ben Burkwam in 2010 failed to yield at an intersection in California. He was carrying a trailer on his truck with political signs for a local Republican candidate. He failed to yield at an intersection, turned into traffic, and killed a 57-year-old motorcyclist. There was like a lawsuit, a wrongful death lawsuit that was kind of resolved, settled out of court. Looks like there was maybe an insurance payment to the family. But it just goes to show that like how shameless these people are. You know, they are essentially trying to convince MAGA people that certain subgroups of people are uniformly dangerous and criminals, and that they kill people, when of course they are all guilty of these transgressions themselves. It's kind of like all projection. And it is, you know, I've been thinking a lot about it, and it's like, it's not hypocrisy necessarily. It is actually a very consistent ideology, which is that for the in-group, for MAGA, the law does not apply.
Right.
For everyone in the out-group, it's, you know, the law, you know, binds them, and we can do whatever we want to them. And I think that's kind of what doing this story brought into focus for me. But that's all to say, Burkwam has done dozens of these ride-alongs with ICE and produced reliably, you know, pro-ICE propaganda. He he calls himself a journalist, but he wears an ICE hat. He says God bless ICE. Like it should be an insult to actual journalists who do their job. It should be infuriating for people to see that. And he, but you know, the reason I think that ICE partners with influencers like this is not only because they know they're going to get sympathetic coverage, but in a way it kind of outsources propaganda for them. And it, you know, because Burkwam is ostensibly independent and is not working for the government, it allows them this veneer of transparency that they are like giving access to their operations. And Burkwam in return gets really dramatic footage of these immigration raids that he can make into viral propaganda that will ultimately get him more followers, get him more money, get him more success, make him a bigger name. So it's kind of like a mutually beneficial relationship for a fascist project.
Yeah, it seems to me that the Trump administration is essentially deploying a bunch of third-rate Leni Riefenstahls, for this effort.
That's such an annoyingly good line. I wish I had used it for my article. But yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. Is this all to just amp up the base, or do we have any sense that this propaganda is going wider and is reaching people beyond that bubble?
Yeah, it's definitely reaching people beyond that bubble. I think the other thing, the role that these influencers play, is this media scholar that I talked to, AJ Bauer, he called it the Nick Shirley effect, right? Like they all want to be the person that goes super viral for a story. In Nick Shirley's case, it was the Somali daycare fraud story, but also to have a story that creates the pretext for the Trump administration to do something crazy. So, in Minneapolis, it was Nick Shirley's videos created the pretext for ICE to occupy that city and terrorize that city. And I think people like Burkwam are, they want to be the next Nick Shirley in that regard. They want to go super viral, be the center of attention, and allow the Trump administration to, provide them a pretext to go further and harsher and more aggressive than they have already. And when you look at Burkwam's content, he talks in very dehumanizing language about the people protesting ICE. The language he uses is not only dehumanizing immigrants, but really he saves his vitriol for the people turning up to protest against ICE and disrupt ICE. He calls them cockroaches. He calls them a scab that needs to be cut off, the pus to be squirted out. He calls them all types of horrible things. Classic dehumanizing language that would allow the state to do whatever it wants to the people standing up to ICE. And you see him use some of this language within earshot of ICE agents that he's embedding with. And, from what we can see in the footage, these ICE agents aren't disagreeing with him. So I think it's a pretty dangerous partnership in that regard. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Burkwam or someone like him be at the center of another ICE crackdown like we saw in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard that kind of rhetoric from Steve Bannon, calling protesters demon possessed. We've seen just the extreme violence that ICE and CBP agents have committed. Obviously, most famously with Renee Good and Alex Preddy, but there have been several other people who have been killed as well. And just over the weekend at Delaney Hall in New Jersey, there was a protester who was hit by a car. And I'm wondering, when you have people embedded like these influencers, and they're celebrating violence against immigrants and protesters, they seem to be crossing over the line from just chronicling it on film, but being active participants.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think there's no denying that they are essentially an extension of the Trump administration. They might work at a place called Real America's Voice or have a press pass, and this is part of a larger trend, by the way, of what we're seeing happening in the White House and the Pentagon, where they're pushing out mainstream, kind of respected media organizations and replacing them with, influencers, like, Laura Loomer asking questions at a Pentagon press briefing, and stuff like that. So, it's not only it's part of a wider effort to attack the press and shut out the press, and shield what they're doing from any real criticism. One of the other things that having an influencer like Ben Burkwam on an ICE ride-along, as opposed to someone from a mainstream outlet, even though ICE still allows ride-alongs to mainstream outlets, what you can rely on someone like Ben to do is also maybe to leave footage out of what they publish. And so, for example, there's a lawsuit in Minneapolis against the Trump administration for racial profiling. And this Somali American dude, a U.S. citizen, is shoveling snow outside his house with ICE, with his mom, when ICE turns up and starts harassing them and demanding that they prove their citizenship and ask them why they're speaking in a foreign language. It's like, seems like a pretty blatant example of racial profiling. And this lawsuit mentions Ben Burkwam being there and filming this. But from what I've seen, that footage of this kind of harassment, blatant racial profiling, does not appear in Bovino's videos, which is to say that another reason that he can be trusted upon is maybe not to publish some stuff.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us about your reporting. I know that this is, really heavy stuff for you to be digging into, but as somebody who's been covering fascism and extremism for years, I know this is totally within your wheelhouse. But can you tell us the best way that people can find some of your recent reporting?
Yeah, sure. So I've been writing some stuff for MS Now and for Talking Points Memo. And on a much, you can find me at Let's Go Mathias on X and Blue Sky. I don't really post on X that much anymore, but I'm there. And I also got to write about something really nice last week, which was the Knicks parade in, and I wrote for The Guardian. So I sometimes write for The Guardian. You can find me there. Very, very briefly, by the way, the Knicks parade was such an amazing, joyful, diverse thing. It was such a rejection of everything we just talked about. So I would encourage you to read that. But thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
Oh, thank you so much. And let's go ahead and put your book up again. Of course, you can always get this anywhere where you purchase or go to your local library as well. To Catch a Fascist, it's an excellent read. Really gets into the people who have been doing the work on the ground to fight fascism for years.
Yeah,
thank
you so much. Yeah. All right, take care.